Hello and welcome. Today we are reviewing a video by Rick Beato and his thoughts on this Chicago song. So let's go ahead and dive right on in. I'm Dr. Zach. Grab a cup of tea and join me. All right, so since this is a review instead of a react, I went ahead and have some notes based on the things he has to say about this song. The song that he is breaking down is called Make Me Smile by Chicago, which isn't anywhere in the title, so that would have been kind of nice just to know what song he was talking about in this video. Let's go ahead and hear what he has to say.
Right there, that D minor to G catches your ear, right? So the song is pretty much in A flat. It starts on the C minor, the 3 chord, to 1, to 5. Then it's a 2, 5, back to C. It's really a 2, 5, a secondary dominant, this 5, G7 leading back to the C minor. Pre-chorus.
Okay. So I don't know where he thought A flat came from, because we start on C minor, we end on C minor, and then we get the dominant chord of C minor, which is G7, which the dominant chord is usually a big indicator of the key that we're in, especially if we're at the end of a progression. And what he says is he says that it's a secondary dominant. So he thinks that this is an A flat, and what a secondary dominant is when you have that dominant chord from another key. So you're kind of borrowing it. So the dominant chord of A flat would be E flat, whereas the dominant chord of C would be G. And usually to make this really obvious that it belongs in the key of C, you also add the 7th, because it's that kind of quality that is unique to the key. So if you think of like E flat being the primary dominant of A flat, right? It is the one that you have. We don't call it that, but you can kind of think of it that way. Then like having another dominant chord, in this case G7, that would be the secondary dominant, right? So we have this secondary dominant G7, which then is going to where you would expect it to go, which is C. But if we're just in the key of C, then that's what we would have. And if we listen to this one more time, just real quickly, see if you can sing where you hear like the home note.
E catches your ear, right? So the song is pretty much in A flat. It starts on the C minor, the 3 chord, to 1, to 5. Then it's a 2, 5, back to C. It's really a 2.
But if we were to sing our home notes, bum, let's go check that. That should be a C, right? Bum, that sounds like where we landed. Yep, that's a C. So I would say that this part is in C minor, like hands down, without a doubt. Even getting the D minor before that, 2 to 5 to 1, that is such a strong progression in C minor. I'm not sure where he got A flat from. So I disagree that that G7 is a secondary dominant. I think that is our dominant in our key of C minor, not A flat. So skipping ahead a little bit,
sing like that back in 1970. You got to remember, they didn't really have sound reinforcement systems that would project out to a big audience. Floor monitors. I mean, you're really just having to use your inner ear to hear yourself, and his tuning is excellent there, right? And this is really high in his range. You can hear when he goes to the end of that pre-chorus, it's very, very high up in his range. I remember.
So I find this so funny because he's basically just impressed that the guy can sing in tune. This is before auto-tune, right? This song was created in the 70s, and so there's no auto-tune. If you're going into the recording studio, right, studio time's expensive. You want to be able to get it on like pretty much the first take. These people practiced, right? They practiced really hard, and to be so surprised that he can sing like in tune and high in his range, it'd be like all these singers that are, training and really trying, to master their voice are probably sitting here going, what? Are you kidding me? Like, he's just impressed that he's singing in tune. So it's kind of interesting. Now, as far as auto-tune goes, I don't have a problem with auto-tune. I think that it is a great tool. It can also be used for like some artistic expression, right? You can use that to kind of be like have an additional way to be expressive with your voice. However, there are a few considerations. One, some people use it as a crutch instead of a tool. So they never really learn how to sing properly and in tune. Like in this case, singing really high in your range, you need a lot of support, right? You need a lot of breath support. And sometimes people just don't learn that. They just sing, they let auto-tune fix all the errors, and then they're okay with that, which, is kind of too bad. The other thing you have to realize is when you are using auto-tune for like a stylistic effect, you can get these really cool sounds that are really difficult or next to impossible to imitate with the human voice. So when you hear these things and you go, oh man, I want to sing like that, and you start like really killing your voice trying to make those sounds, realize that that's not how your voice should sound. That's not like a natural thing. And if you want to imitate that, that's fine, but just realize that you need to use the tool to achieve that effect. And if you try to just use your voice, you can really end up hurting yourself. So like I said, I don't think auto-tune is like a bad thing per se, but I think it can be used incorrectly.
The melody in the pre-chorus, time and time again I see your face smiling inside. I love that there because it's using, it's really Phrygian.
You can hear it. Bum, right? Where are we landing in that key? Oh, I have a guess. Here we go. Yep. You guessed it. It's C. We've landed back at C. Yet he thinks that this is like G Phrygian dominant. And the reason is because you hear that there's a half step there. And that is what a characteristic of Phrygian is, that you have a half step between the first two notes of the scale. Instead of right, where we have a whole step like a lot of other modes. But if we sing the whole melody, we hear it landing on bum and C. Beato has a lot of this theoretical knowledge. I mean, he knows what G Phrygian dominant is. He's just not really applying it in the right way, because in order for this to be G Phrygian dominant, it would have to sound like we ended and rested on G, that was our home note. And it doesn't. It sounds like we're still just in C minor this whole time. And when I was trying to check this, I just thought, okay, how would I play this if this was in C minor? And I got the whole melody correct, no mistakes, because it was like, yeah, of course, this is just C minor. That makes way more sense than trying to think about it in like a G Phrygian dominant type of sense. It's just not right.
That's a perfect three-part harmony for horn arranging there, right? You have the one descending line, then you have the middle part, which moves between two notes, and the high part is static on the high E flat. And with the trumpet being up high like that, it just gives this intensity to it. Let's show you.
Okay, I wanted to highlight this point. He's talking about these kind of like stings from the horn section. A lot of times I hear people say, well, why do we have to learn about voice leading, right? In music theory, why do we have to learn about voice leading and all these rules? And here he basically tells you, he's like, look, we have one that's just descending, we have one that stays the same, we have another that's just kind of oscillating between two notes, and it sounds great. Well, that's all just Western classical tradition kind of voice leading techniques. Not to say that those techniques are like the best and most aesthetically pleasing all the time, but nonetheless, like you can use these techniques in something like a popular rock song to help the piece kind of have this nice effect, right? So it's just another tool to use. And while, yes, it isn't quite the same as like a Bach chorale where you have 4 parts of voices, like you can still use some of these principles to help make your piece sound a little bit smoother or get that kind of effect that he said like is really nice.
You used to hear those kind of walking parts from Paul McCartney all the time. People played walking bass lines in rock music back in the 60s and the 70s. I mean, that's really...
Okay, so I have a problem with this here. He said people play walking bass lines. Now, the part that we missed here is the bass line went like it had this kind of fill, right? And that's really what I would call that. And say the bass had a fill here. It became more active, right? It had something. I really wouldn't call it a walking bass line because a walking bass line kind of brings up this very specific picture of what to expect. And in fact, let's go ahead and look at another video right now that talks about walking bass line.
It's about, and all walking bass lines as well, if you did not know this, are improvised, okay? That's the thing.
Okay, so right there, all walking bass lines are improvised. The riff that we heard earlier may or may not have been improvised, so let's keep on listening.
This That is not a walking bass line. It's confused a lot of the time. People think that's a walking bass line. Just because you're playing quarter notes doesn't mean it's a walking bass line. A walking bass line is improvised, okay? Now,
okay, there we go. So, like you said, just because you're playing quarter notes. So one of the defining characteristics of a walking bass line is a steady bum, 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 right? But then we're moving through different pitches through the progression. And like I said, it's improvised. Now, the improvised thing is kind of interesting because if you were to play bass like in a jazz ensemble, chances are that you figured out your own bass line. So you were improvising and then writing down what you improvised, like what you liked as you played. And then that no longer becomes improvisation. However, once you get good enough, you can like kind of use that basic bass line that you made and work around it. Decide, oh, I'm going to do a little something different here, a little something different there, right? It's still very open to that improvisation. So that's kind of what he's saying here, right? That walking bass line, it's supposed to be improvised. You're supposed to have this kind of like freedom to play with it and change it and do this type of thing. And what Beato has been saying was that this one little like fill from the bass that got a little bit more active, wasn't just like following the rhythmic groove, but rather had a more like steady pulse. He called that a walking bass line, which doesn't make any sense. This leads me into a story of a music appreciation student who once went to a recital and heard a cellist play the famous Bach Cello Suite number 1. Now, there's a consistent rhythm here, right? Bum, 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 bum. And so I can see how the student, if they were just told a walking bass line is when you have a bass instrument, because cello is considered a bass voice, right? Even though it's not the lowest voice, which is the double bass for strings. So if you have a bass instrument that has a consistent rhythm, right? That is what we call walking bass. And with that definition, the Bach Cello Suite kind of fits. So they said, I heard this Bach Cello Suite and I heard the wonderful walking bass line that it had. But that's not it, right? Walking bass is more like this. So you hear there, every once in a while, there's like a little bit of a kicker, right? Bum, 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 you get that kind of like extra little bit. But otherwise, it's really steady. It usually is used in like jazz context. Not to say you can't use it in a rock context, but usually we hear it in jazz. It has this improvisatory element to it that's really important. So I just think this is kind of the wrong terminology to be using.
That sounds like something John Williams would write, like a fanfare. Da-ga-da, 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 da-ga-da.
Okay, that part kind of cracks me up because it's like, John Williams? That's the only composer you could think of? Like, sure, John Williams is good. He has borrowed a lot from the people who came before him. Not to say that those people didn't borrow also. I was thinking, how about someone like Copland, Fanfare for the Common Man? Or even better, Joan Towers, Fanfares for the Uncommon Woman, right? Those are really impactful pieces. Especially recommend checking out the ones by Joan Tower that he could have pulled from, and his like go-to was John Williams, which I think is just kind of funny.
Flat major to B major 7. The whole bridge is just a 2-5 in the key of D. So it's E minor 7 to A7 to A13.
Okay, this also does not make any sense to me because if it's a 2-5 in the key of D, that would be E to A, which is true. But we never get a D here. And yes, we can like suggest another key without ever going to the tonic of that key, but that's not very common, especially in popular music. What I hear is instead something more like this. All right, so right before we get into this bridge, we have this B minor, which then takes us to E minor. Okay, and then we get to A. Then we get to A13, which would sound kind of something like this, I would think. And then we get back to E. So for me, especially since we had that B chord before it, even though it's not in what we would usually see like the dominant, function, we get back to E. So to me, it sounds like we ended up on E. Now, there's a couple of ways we could got into this. If we're in the key of A flat, like Beato thinks, we could go to the third note here, right? Make it a minor third instead of, there's the major third that we expect. Instead, we get that minor third, and instead of calling this C flat, we would then call this B natural. And then we would get that chord here, which would take us to E. However, if we're in the key of C minor, which is where I think we are, right, then that B minor is just a slight alteration of the leading tone, B chord. So that would be a true secondary kind of dominant idea, except for we don't actually have that dominant quality. However, I think the motion from here and then adding in this A chord and then even like the A13, which we'll get to in a second, that's enough to make this sound kind of like the home note. So how we form an A13 chord, just because that sounds like a little strange. In music, with this like triadic harmony, right, we have the first note, so we call that 1. We skip a note, so we have 3. And we skip a note, and we have 5. We keep skipping notes, then we have 7, 9, 11, and then 13 up here. Okay? And then that is pretty much as far as we can go, because if we go up another skip, we get back to our starting area with the A. So for an A13 chord, the other interesting part of it is we are using every single note in the scale, just spaced out over a wider distance. So A13 chord can kind of have whatever you want in it. It was something like this for the A13 chord. I added a lot of those kind of color tones to it, including the 13th here. And I think that even could be analyzed, depending on how it's voiced, it could have been analyzed as some sort of B chord, because F sharp is part of that B minor. My guess is if I had all of the notes of this A13 chord, they could be reinterpreted into some sort of B chord, with maybe then this A acting as the 7th of that B chord, or a pedal tone that just kind of carries through and actually doesn't determine what the chord name is. Again, though, if it was a B chord, most likely it's the 7th. So that's just a little bit about this section. The only other thing is going from A to E, right? We have those two notes are a fourth apart. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we get what's called plagal motion. When you go from a 4 to a 1, we call that plagal motion in music. So it's not uncommon to see plagal motion. It's actually rarer than a lot of other types of cadences that we see. But here we are just kind of getting that plagal motion. Plus, if this A13 is actually a B chord, it'd just be E minor 1, A4, a B chord for 5, and then going back to 1, which is like the most common progression ever. So I think that this all is actually in E minor, and those are my reasons why. I don't understand why Rick Beato thought that this was D major when we never get a D major chord. We only get what would be the 2 and the 5 of D major. Maybe he was thinking, since we get the 5 chord of D, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, our A chord here, that it must have been a D kind of key area, but we never actually get that. I don't hear that as the home note, and so I don't think he's correct in that.
This B flat 11 chord. That's really the 5 chord that leads to the E flat. Now I said the song's in A flat, but this is definitely a secondary, would be like a secondary dominant chord.
Okay, so again, I'm questioning his use of secondary dominant here, because to me, like, it sounds more like kind of a modulation, and we end up like where he had that bum 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 here. This is where I feel like the home note is. Let's go ahead and check that. So that is E flat. So instead of saying like, oh, well, we have this secondary dominant, right? Remember, a dominant from like outside of this key that just goes to our dominant of E flat in the key of A flat. We can just say that, well, this just sounds like we modulated or maybe tonicized, but I think it's actually a modulation here to E flat. I mean, we have the 5-to-1 in E flat. I hear this, especially after you play that whole progression, I hear our home note as E flat. So I think that's where we ended up, right? We checked our tonic, we hear E flat, and I think that that's just where we kind of landed. Also, he mentions a lot about sus chords in this, and how he really loves the sus chord sound. And B flat 11 is basically a sus chord. So it's just kind of following that same pattern that we've had before. The main difference between a B flat 11 and a B flat sus chord is that you would still have the third of the chord in there, but otherwise they're like the exact same. So I don't know why he wouldn't draw a comparison between the B flat 11 and the other sus chords, since that seems to be an important like harmony in this song. That's pretty much all I had to say about his review of this song. He has a few things going for him. One, he has a great ear. Okay, like he can hear all these different elements of the piece and kind of identify them, and then he's applying some of his theory knowledge to it. We saw that a lot of his kind of theory that he thought was happening in the song was just kind of incorrect. And the way that you can tell is where you hear that home note. So I guess if he heard the home note in those different places, like as A flat for A flat major in the whole thing instead of C minor for the verse, or if he really heard like G Phrygian dominant, then he could have an argument there, but I just don't hear it. And especially in popular music, things are usually more simple than you'd think. And so like the simplest answer is usually better. So one thing about his kind of breakdown is that the isolations are really nice. If you go and watch his video, you can hear like just the voice, just the horns, just the drums, that sort of thing. So like that's kind of nice to hear all those individual pieces, and that was something that I thought was a good aspect of his video. However, right in the title, what makes this song great? Same thing that he opens up his video with. What makes this song great? He actually doesn't really answer that question. All he does is show you the individual elements and basically state facts about them. Like he said, oh, these horn stings have perfect voice leading. That's more my words. But, he said they have perfect voice leading. And it's kind of like, great. A lot of things have really great voice leading. Oh, well, we have these, chords that go to this area. Well, we have a lot of songs that can go to different kind of key areas. And like, this is something that I actually struggled with when I first wanted to take music analysis seriously, is it's really easy to just tell people facts. Well, this is what happens. Then it goes to this. Then it goes to that. But at the end of the day, the question is, so what? He never really answered that so what of all of this stuff. He just gave us the individual pieces and didn't tell us how it all kind of fits together as a whole. To me, it'd be kind of like if you memorized the Latin names of every single animal, but then you didn't know what the animal looked like. So you could be like, oh, yes, I know, this, give the Latin name and some characteristics and whatever. And then someone would show you a picture and you'd be like, but wait, what's that? That's what this kind of feels like. He has all the terminology. He just doesn't like get the whole big picture. He never like tells you what the animal actually looks like. That's just kind of my take on this. I would say, if I was to give this a grade, I'd probably give it like a C, maybe C plus. For information, because he misapplied a lot of the theory. He didn't actually hear the like correct key areas for the different parts of the song. But it's obvious that he has the theoretical knowledge. It's obvious he has a great ear. And there are some things like, when he talked about all the sus chords and things, all of those were correct. So it's not like he got everything completely wrong, but he got a lot of it wrong. And so I just, I'm happy with like a C to C plus grade, kind of average, got most of the things correct, but there was a lot that was just incorrect, mostly when it came to like more advanced terms and concepts. He just didn't quite get that. So I'd say that's kind of average. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.